Hi nurses, welcome to Shift Change, the podcast for nurse leaders who are ready to shift their thinking from just a nurse to claim their position as a powerful agent for change. I'm your host, Amy Deagle, founder and CEO of the International Network of Nurse Leaders. We believe in the power of nurses to change the world, so let's get started.
Hi nurses, and welcome back to another edition of the Shift Change podcast. I'm so excited you are here with us today. As I mentioned last week, we are moving to a weekly production schedule with the Shift Change podcast for 2020 to celebrate Year of a Nurse. So I am really excited to be ramping that up for you. I have a lot of great guests who've recorded podcasts over the last few weeks and months, and so I'm so excited to bring you all of their interviews on an accelerated schedule. I just wanted to take a moment and talk about our Year of the Nurse challenge. It's a free challenge that's running over at nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse, and it's really about getting you into action. And I really want to make 2020 the year that we move the nursing profession forward and we start taking action on some of these things that we just constantly talk about that we would like to see change happening with, but we aren't united as one voice to actually make that change happen. So that's my hope, is that we will start leading a movement of change, get people into activity, really start seeing themselves as leaders. So if you're interested in that challenge, just jump over to nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse. I have a great interview for you today with Robin Cogan. Robin is a nationally certified school nurse. She's currently in her 19th year as a New Jersey school nurse in the Camden City School District. She serves on several national boards, including the American Foundation for Firearm Injury Reduction in Medicine, or AFIRM, a gun violence prevention research nonprofit organization, and the National Board of Certification for School Nurses. Robin is the legislative chair for the New Jersey State School Nurses Association. She's proud to be a Johnson & Johnson School Health Leadership Fellow and past program mentor. She has been recognized in her home state of New Jersey and nationally for her community-based initiative, the Community Cafe, A Conversation That Matters. Robin is the honored recipient of multiple awards for her work in school nursing and population health. These awards include the 2019 National Association of School Nurses President's Award, the 2018 NCSN School Nurse of the Year, 2017 Johnson & Johnson School Nurse of the Year, and the New Jersey Department of Health and 2017 Population Health Hero Award. Robin serves as faculty in the School Nurse Certificate Program at Rutgers University Camden School of Nursing, where she teaches the next generation of school nurses. She was presented the 2018 Rutgers University Camden Chancellor's Teaching Excellence Award for part-time faculty. Robin writes a weekly blog called The Relentless School Nurse, and we will make sure that we have Robin's blog and all of her social media contact info linked in the show notes so that you can check out her incredible blog. You may also recognize Robin as one of our speakers from the Not Just a Nurse Day, and her presentation then was just phenomenal, and her episode coming at you right now is just as great. So without further ado, we're going to get to the interview with Robin.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Shift Change podcast. I am so excited to have Robin here today. Robin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Amy. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
I am so excited that we finally are here recording this. We've been talking about this for quite some time, and I mentioned to everybody you were one of the amazing speakers for Not Just a Nurse Day, and when we recorded your presentation, I just sat there with my jaw open and tears streaming down my face because you have such an incredible story. So I would love for you to share that with the audience and do a deep dive into your nursing career and some of those highlights that you've had so far.
Sure. Well, do you have a really long time, Amy? Because I've been a nurse since 1985. But actually, before I became a nurse, I was an art therapist. So I came into nursing, certainly not as a second career, because I really hadn't totally started my first career. But I became a nurse after I finished my art therapy training, I was feeling like I was missing some important information in terms of looking at the whole person. And I happened to have been doing my um, final practicum in a psych unit of a general hospital in Philadelphia. And at the time, this would never happen today, but at the time, there was a group of nursing students coming through doing their psych rotation, and one of their peers was an inpatient on our unit. Can you imagine that
Wow.
happening today?
No.
Yeah. So I watched kind of the interaction between the students and the patient and the faculty. It was really very interesting. I mean, this was so many years ago and it still stays with me. And I realized then that I was missing this really significant piece of information. And so I had a choice to either continue and get my master's in art therapy or social work. And instead, I took a complete left-hand turn and decided to go to nursing school. So I did complete nursing school. It was not in my plan. Um, and when I finished nursing school, of course, my heart was with psych nursing. So that's where I really started as a nurse. And I still, to this day, all these decades later, find that that is the best training I ever had for the work that I do, even as a school nurse now. So my original nursing career involved more of, I did psych and substance use disorder. Of course, back then it was called something else. I didn't really have a very clear path, I'll be honest with you. I was not very intentional and I didn't have a mentor. And I was kind of blowing with the wind. It really wasn't a very clear path. And then I ended up in case management and started working in occupational health. Again, using my psych background always. And I worked for a big railroad, and the railroad was taken over, and we were all either given an opportunity to follow the company to a completely different city or have a severance. And that's what I chose because I had a really young family and my husband's work was kind of entrenched in this area. I live outside of Philadelphia. And I took a sabbatical. Well, I called it a sabbatical. It was really a severance. And my very young children wanted to go to overnight camp. So I went with them as a barter for the girls to go to camp. And my bunkmates were all school nurses.
Mhm.
And that fall, when I finished my first summer at camp, where I have to say I then spent 10 more summers after that, I went back to school and got my school nurse certificate. So that's my that's my journey to school nursing. I've now been a school nurse for 19 years. It's probably the longest I've ever stayed in any one place. And and that is where my career has been. I work in in an urban school district called Camden, New Jersey, and this is I just started my 19th year as a school nurse.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So, Robin, one of the things you were mentioning, when we first talked was the power of social media and what's that has meant for your career. So can you tell us a bit about, specifically, I'm thinking the LinkedIn interaction you had and that story as well.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So if you can just kind of touch on the power of social media within nursing, and especially I would love to share with the listeners of this podcast your LinkedIn story, as we'll call it.
Sure. So I do want to touch a little bit on leadership if I could for a minute, because it's all related to social media. Is that okay?
Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So in my work as a school nurse, there was an opportunity to apply to become a Johnson & Johnson School Health Leadership Fellow. And this fellowship required that you have someone from your school district, specifically like a supervisor or principal, come with you to a week-long training in leadership. And part of the training is then you bring an initiative back to your school district. Well, from the time I joined the school district, which was 2001, until the time I finally was able to get a team together was 15 years.
Wow.
So, yeah. And the reason I'm telling you that story is because I am such a believer in investing in our own professional development.
Mm-hmm.
And I was very frustrated that I could not get a team together for 14 years. I tried every year and I kept getting turned down. And I felt very much alone in the sense of, why am I the only person who feels it's important to invest in our own professional development? It was very frustrating for me. Eventually, I contacted J&J directly and I said, listen, I'm a school nurse. I want this training. I feel really strongly about it. Can I join in any other way? Can I join another team? Can I create a team that didn't exist? Anyway, to make a long story short, I was able to put together a county team. We applied and we were accepted. So in 2015, I became a Johnson & Johnson School Health Leadership Fellow, and that was my personal and professional leadership moonshot, I call it. If it had not been for that 1 week training, none of the things that happened to me following that would have happened. I would have continued in my kind of day-to-day life of which is a wonderful life of being a school nurse, but I wouldn't have explored things like social media, Twitter, writing, blogging. I don't think I would have had the impetus or the courage to take anything else on by what I was already doing. So
So before you dive in then to the social media question I asked, can you tell us a bit more about what was it about that week?
Oh, it was just, so let me say that for almost 30 years, Johnson & Johnson supported school nurses, and they provided this intensive leadership training they would bring in faculty from across the country, and we spent the entire week looking at things like how to do presentations, looking at data to understand what's happening in our communities and where the gaps in services were, really looking at a much bigger picture, like taking a breath, taking a step back and saying, where am I in this journey of being a school nurse, and what else can I do what else can I bring to my community that will help with things like equity and, better health outcomes for our kids. And just the fact that they invested so much in us, I felt very much, not really, it wasn't obligated to give back, but I felt inspired to give back.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was just, it doesn't often happen. I think it's sad to say that we're not used to being treated so well. Isn't that just an awful thing to say? But that's how I felt. I don't remember any other experience that I felt truly that somebody was investing in us to be part of something much bigger than ourselves.
Yeah,
That's how I felt.
And I don't think you're wrong for feeling that way. I think that's a very common feeling in nursing.
In nursing, yeah.
Is that we're expected to care for everybody else around us, but the caring for each other and from the top down seems to be missing in a lot of places. Not every place,
Right.
but I just even remember in nursing school, my grandpa passed away, and they weren't going to let me leave clinical one day early so that I could fly out with my family to catch the funeral. And if I would have missed that day, they were going to, my grades would have suffered. And I thought, like, this is the last day of clinical. I know I'm not going to get a whole bunch of learning on one last shift. And it meant that I could fly out with my family, and nope, they wouldn't do that. And I just remember feeling so unsupported and uncared for. And I thought, we're trying to teach, they're trying to teach us how to be caring people. And this profession is supposed to be so caring. And yet we don't get that a lot of times within the profession, which is too bad.
And your experience is not uncommon, Amy. I've heard that story. I've experienced that story. And now I'm a faculty at Rutgers University in Camden, where I teach upcoming school nurses, and I try my best to not be that, and we have to take a look at it in our profession and be honest and transparent and say we have to do better. And I feel like the tide is turning, but we have a lot more to go.
Yeah, I definitely see that it is improving, and that's, thanks to people like you that are in those positions and really are working from a heart-centered place. And, we've had Sheena Howard on the podcast, and she was on Not Just a Nurse Day talking about love-led leadership and how really that's the movement that we need to be creating with nurses. And I see that more and more now.
Well, I do believe in this world of trauma, honestly, that we
Mm-hmm.
need to be trauma responsive. And it's almost, to me, it's a universal precaution. Let's just imagine that everybody we come across, including ourselves, has experienced some level of trauma in this world. So
Yeah.
I use that trauma, that trauma responsive is a universal precaution in my mind. And so that's how I move through my work.
I love that. That's so insightful. So I do want to dig into more about that piece, but let's go back to the social media piece. Let's hear your LinkedIn story, and then we're going to pivot back to more, dive further into your career and some of those things that you've had an opportunity to do.
Oh, sure. So, I have so many fun social media stories, but this is definitely one of my favorites. I started, so this goes back to Johnson and Johnson also. The initiative that I brought to my community was called it's still going on actually, called a community cafe. And really what it is a courageous conversation with families about what is, in our case, what we ask to our families is what is working and what is not working with your children's healthcare experience. And the reason we ask that is because when I would send a child home from school sick, inevitably they would go to the emergency room for non-emergent reasons instead of their own pediatrician. And I didn't understand why. Now I could have imagined why, because, as nurses, we can predict, right? But I really wanted to understand from the parents' perspective, where was the disconnect? Why wasn't there a relationship? That's what it felt like to me. Where was the relationship? So I needed to bring an evidence-based initiative, and I found a program called the World Cafe. And basically, it really is a series, it's not even a series of questions, it's basically posting one or two questions and letting the participants lead the discussion. So it's really community-based solutions to problems that are presented. So the problem I presented was what is working and what isn't working with your child's healthcare experience. And the answers that I got really surprised me. We've done a series of cafes. Now, these started in 2015 and they still continue on today. We've done a series around healthcare issues, around parenting, around co-parenting. What does it feel like to be a father who's co-parenting, in a situation? And we've just had many, many different topics over the last few years, but specifically, I was really excited about this community cafe project, and I was on LinkedIn. That was one of our assignments for the Johnson & Johnson leadership program, is that we needed a LinkedIn profile. So I happened to be on LinkedIn, which I find really helpful and useful to connect to people, to connect to organizations. Anyway, I saw this most adorable picture of a woman with two Muppets on either side of her. And there was an article that she had written called Sesame Street in Communities. And I had never heard of it. Now, this was probably 3 years ago now. I had never heard of it. I read through the whole article. It was so interesting. Sesame Street was starting this educational arm to really take on some of our biggest, we call them like wicked problems. They were talking about trauma, about adverse childhood experiences, about emergencies, hurricanes, homelessness. I mean, they have taken on some huge problems. And what they've done is they've provided free professional development for parents and for teachers. And the information that they provide it's just so well done. And anyway, the article was fantastic. And I wrote to the person, I sent them a private message, and I shared with them my community cafe project. And I said, I'm a school nurse and I work in an urban school district with many of these really complicated issues. And I wanted to share this project with you. So I put in, I had written an article about the community cafe. So I put in some information, and I didn't hear back until about a week later. I got the nicest message back from this woman. Her name's Jeanette Bentoncourt. Now, again, I didn't know who she was, but she wrote me this lovely message, and she said, I'm really interested in what you're doing. Can you please tell me more? I actually never thought about the role of a school nurse in terms of preschool, because I happen to actually now be a preschool nurse. So I wrote back to her immediately, and I sent her a video and I sent her some other things, and she wrote right back to me. And it turns out that Jeanette Bentoncourt is the Senior Vice President of Sesame Workshop. and she was on a train, and the train had broken down, and she had nothing to do for the next hour but talk to me. So we were going back and forth, and we had this great talk about school nursing and the impact on especially preschoolers' health, and how it's such an ideal time to work with families and parents. And I sent her more information about my community, and within just a very short time, she sent me 400 books for all my students and all their teachers. And I was so moved and appreciative. And anyway, I gave out all the books. They were all the same book. It was about Julia, who was a brand new Muppet that they introduced, who was on the spectrum. Interesting that they chose a girl, because typically autism is found in boys. So everything they do is very intentional and based in, in steeped in deep research. But anyway, I took pictures of the kids reading the books and the teachers reading to the kids, and I posted them, with permission, of course, all over social media. And the next thing I know, they made me a Sesame hero. And then,
So cool.
which was really exciting. And then from there, I stayed in touch with Jeanette, and she said, I think we need to have a more formal relationship with your national organization. So I connected them to my national organization, the National Association of School Nurses, and they had several meetings. Jeanette ended up being one of our keynote speakers at our national conference. She and I have written an article together that was published in our journal. And our relationship continues to this day. So that's just one great social media story, because I reached out to one person.
I love that. I love the story, and I love how, that was a divine intervention, the train being broke down so she could talk to you. But it really just shows about the power of reaching out. And I mean, Robin, you and I connected on Twitter because I saw an article you had posted, and I reached out and said, hey, I'm doing this thing, Not Just a Nurse Day. Would you be interested? And I just want to take a minute and just, encourage anybody who's out there listening to get connected on social media. Nurses Who Tweet on Twitter is a huge following. There's such great conversations happening. Same with on LinkedIn. There's so many inspiring, positive, uplifting nurses out there that if you're feeling kind of stuck in your own world or in the trenches, it's so great to kind of come up for air and get connected with these other people. And honestly, if you find that courage to just reach out, amazing things can happen in just the act of reaching out, because people are so professionally generous.
I agree with you. So many things have happened, absolutely, and only. If it was only for Twitter, I have 20 Twitter stories just from Twitter. I mean, it is really a very powerful medium. And there are incredibly professionally generous people in nursing, and actually outside of nursing, who really want to understand what nurses do a little better.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so true. And that's really our, as we're working at being better to each other, working to then also educate outside of our profession and bring awareness to our value as well is really important. Yeah. So I do want to get into your advocacy work, but first I want to just talk about a little bit more. Was there any other pieces of advice that you had for nurses who maybe don't realize that leadership is a career path within nursing, and any advice that you would have for them?
Leadership is a career path. I have this, I wrote a blog called, I think it was called something like, you are the chief wellness officer, even if you don't have that official title. Sometimes we have to take on titles that we give ourselves. And in school nursing anyway, there's not a lot of upward mobility. You're kind of in the same job for your whole career.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit limiting, a little bit frustrating sometimes. And so in what I describe is I had to grow horizontally instead of vertically, because there just wasn't upward mobility. And so sometimes, we have to create those opportunities for ourselves and act as if, even if we don't have that title, that's who we are in that moment. So leadership is really a way of being in nursing. It doesn't mean you necessarily have the title to go along with it. I also feel strongly that the role of mentorship cannot be underestimated. if there was one thing I could go back and do all over again, there was many things I would go back and do all over again as I'm really looking towards the, not the end of my career, but I've been at this for decades now. So it would be that I would have wanted to identify someone who could be my mentor years before. And so that for me is really a loss, that I did not know enough to do that. And I think things are really changing in nursing. There's a lot more. I think people are recognizing that leadership isn't necessarily management. Leadership is really seeing something in somebody else that they may not see in themselves and helping them move that forward. And you can do that in many different ways, even if you're not that person's direct report.
I love that. And that is the message that we're trying to get out there, is you do not have to have that official title to be a leader. And honestly, I would argue there's nurse managers out there who do not possess great leadership qualities, but do have the official title. And so really it's finding where you can lead where you're at, and things like being professionally generous and kind and compassionate, and finding, connection among people, and creating those little moments where somebody feels supported and cared for is really truly leadership. And whether that's your patients or your colleague, we have opportunities to do that every day as nurses.
We do, and that's one of the reasons I love Twitter, because you have an opportunity to do that quite frequently on Twitter and collaborate with people across the world that you would have never had the opportunity to meet or understand what their work is and share your work. That's why I think it's just a magical place. Not that I don't also use the block button, because I do.
100%. One of the other things I want to mention, though, is a way to be a leader, just in life in general, is really getting involved in some of that advocacy and activism work. And I would love for you to tell us how you became involved with the American Foundation for Firearm Injury Reduction in Medicine, and just your entire story around that. Because when we recorded your Not Just a Nurse Day session, that was so impactful for me. And if you feel comfortable sharing, I would love to have that conversation again with you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So I love that you also use the word activism, because sometimes people shy away from that. But I do call myself a school nurse activist. And this is why. First of all, let me just say that it's personal and professional, and I am comfortable sharing my personal story because I feel like we learn from each other's stories. And unfortunately, in the United States, we have a gun violence epidemic. And in my own personal family history, 2 of my beloved family members have survived mass shootings. The first was my father when he was 12 years old. There was a neighbor who had access to a weapon, had just come home from the war, from World War II. It was 1949, and he murdered 13 people in their block. He killed my grandmother, my grandfather, and my great-grandmother. And my father survived because his mother hid him in a closet. He also killed 10 other people. So 13 people died that day. And my dad was left an orphan at 12 years old. And honestly, for most of his life, he really kept it in and didn't talk about it. I wish now, he died 10 years ago. I was just beginning to understand adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, when he died. I did know about what happened to my dad, but he really suffered in silence for most of his life, and it really impacted his health. He died at least 12 years earlier than he should have. His life expectancy was cut short, and he died of a massive brain bleed. And he was buried on the 60th anniversary of the deaths. So,
I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Unbelievably, the person who did the murders died 6 weeks after my father. And there were just many, many connections. But anyway, fast forward almost 70 years, and my niece is a Parkland student. So my life completely changed on February 14th, 2018 at 2:25 in the afternoon, when my sister called me. And she's an art teacher in Florida, and I'm a school nurse. So we don't typically speak during the day. And I said, Mary, what's the matter? Is everything okay? And she said, no, there's an active shooter at Carly's school, and she's hiding in a closet. Now, my father hid in a closet.
Mm-hmm.
And the second she said that to me, my heart just, broke into a million pieces. And I was at my computer. I turned on CNN, and my sister at the time was literally, you see these iconic pictures of, yellow tape and parents crying and was standing and waiting to find their kid. And that's where my sister was. But I was watching them capture the killer. And I'm like giving her a play by play. And she's standing next to this mom who's saying, I can't get a hold of my daughter. She's not answering me. What am I, and my sister said, what am I supposed to say to her? Her daughter is not talking to her. She's not answering. She's not texting. And at that point, we knew Carly was okay. The killer had been caught. We knew that, it was going to be bad. We didn't know how many people, but this mom was not hearing from her daughter. And her daughter was one of the victims. We found out way late into the night that her daughter was one of the 17 people that were killed. Anyway, I promised my sister that day and my niece, I said, whatever I can do from the public health perspective, I'm going to do it. And so from that moment on, my father's memory to support my niece and my sister, and because I am a school nurse and we live in a very violent society, I became a school nurse activist around gun violence prevention and really believing that it belongs in the public health arena, because it hasn't worked trying to solve it, in any other way at this point. Like, we say at Affirm that when you look at the reason we have seatbelt laws, the reason we have, speed limits, all of these things are public health answers to what were epidemics. Car crashes have gone down significantly because of the research that was done to identify what the biggest causes of death were, right? The same thing with HIV, the same thing with any public health crisis. Gun violence falls in that definition. It's an epidemic. It's really violence, I think, that is the vector, that is really the reason that we're in the situation that we're in. So anyway, I started reaching out on Twitter. I had already started my blog, The Relentless School Nurse, and it really, I changed the focus of what I was doing. I started my blog talking about school nursing and telling stories from my health office, and I soon realized that I really was kind of getting bored with my own stories. And I started finding through Twitter other school nurses across the country that were doing some awesome things. So I started spotlighting them or asking them to write, a guest blog. But then after this happened, I started taking on some of the really big social issues. And of course, gun violence has been my biggest focus. I've also looked at some of the issues going on in this country with the immigrant status and children being separated from their parents at the border, and climate justice. And I've just taken all of those issues and focused on them in my blog and in my work. The reason I became associated with Affirm is through Twitter. I met Megan Ranney, who is one of the co-founders of Affirm. She's an emergency room doctor, and she invited me to their inaugural event where they had their first kind of face-to-face meeting. It was just last February in Chicago, and I was the only nurse at the table. I couldn't believe it. But I've been very active with them. I have to say, I'm really proud of something that happened just this week. I was invited through a pediatric trauma surgeon to submit an article to a trauma journal, a surgical trauma journal called Current Trauma Reports. And his name is Dr. Peter Masiokas, and he is with Boston Children's. And he invited me to submit this article. It's a special edition of Current Trauma Reports devoted to gun violence. And so I pulled in some friends, the dean of my nursing school, the executive director of the National Association of School Nurses, and a colleague from Villanova University. And the four of us wrote an article about gun violence in schools and looking specifically at active shooter drills and how traumatizing they can be. and it did get published, which is I can imagine that we're probably the first group of school nurses that was ever published in Current Trauma Reports.
That's amazing. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It just went live this week. So yeah, I can't actually believe it. And that I'm really proud of that, because I have been very fortunate to have articles accepted in nursing journals and in my National Association journal, but never in a cross sector medical journal.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Hey nurses, I just wanted to take a quick break from the podcast and tell you about something really important that's happening. So 2020 has been designated as Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. And it's really great to be celebrating nurses and to be sharing trending hashtags. But what we really need to do is get into action, because it's up to us. And nothing is going to change if we don't make the change. So there's a movement happening and it needs you. We're stronger together. So come join us as we disrupt the status quo and evolve our profession. It's time. We are stronger together, so let's get started. If you want to know how you can join this movement of change, visit nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse to opt in for a free 3-part video series about how we can use 2020, the Year of the Nurse and Midwife, as the year we finally use our collective voice and lead our profession forward. So jump over to nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse for all the details. Now back to the episode.
So Robin, you mentioned, I just want to dig into this because I'm not sure if everybody listening has the same, well, I know they definitely don't have the same background, but just you mentioned ACEs and the trauma-informed response. And as a primary care nurse, that's something we're digging into with our staff and the physicians within my organization on really starting to use that tool. So I was just wondering if you can kind of give a brief explanation about what that is and how it helps. And just, you mentioned, with your father with the unresolved trauma, that caused chronic conditions later in life and it impacted his medical health. And so if you can just kind of mention what that is and your work around the trauma piece.
Sure, absolutely. Well, ACEs are really, when you think about, they stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And they really are, when you think of children in their most developmental phases, if they are in a period of chronic stress, really toxic stress, it impacts them on the level of their DNA. It really literally gets under your skin. And there's many different kinds of adversity that kids face, whether it's physical or emotional abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. They kind of boil it down to these 10, even though there's way more than 10, these 10 questions that you can do an ACEs screening to see what children have been exposed to. Things like if a parent, if you experienced physical or sexual abuse, has a parent experienced physical or sexual abuse? Was there drugs in the house? Was there a parent incarcerated? I mean, there's these exposure. Was there violence in the house? Exposure to these kinds of experiences in early childhood leads to long-term poor health outcomes. They're actually linking it to long-term long-term health outcomes, things like that cause chronic inflammation, like obesity, diabetes, cardiac disease, cancer. I mean, this is a study that was done in the late 90s through the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. And at that time, they actually were looking at middle-class white suburban America in California. So imagine what kind of outcomes they'd have if they looked at urban centers, and it's very common to have one or more ACEs is not uncommon. If you have 4 or more ACEs, that's when there's a real link to these long-term negative health outcomes. And like I explained with my dad, I mean, what he experienced, I know, changed the course of his life and created, my dad had diabetes. My dad had heart disease. My dad had chronic inflammation. He had gout. He had all of these things linked to, imagine like always being on high alert, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cortisol always racing through your body. What that does to your long-term health.
Mm-hmm.
So depression, substance use, even poor academic achievement, difficulty keeping a job, and then eventually early death.
Mm-hmm.
So ACEs, when you think about toxic stress, there's really a direct correlation. This is being studied at Harvard. It's being studied at the CDC. I mean, I think at first they didn't believe Dr. Folletti and Dr. Anda, who were working in separate spaces on the same issue. I think it was Dr. Folletti who actually had an obesity clinic. This is how it started. And he was really curious as to why his predominantly female patients were regaining all the weight that they lost. And he started asking them some simple questions, and the preponderance of them told him that they had experienced childhood sexual abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And he never realized, because nobody ever asked, how prevalent that was.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something worth looking at. The other side of that, though, which I find really interesting and not as well studied, is when it's a pair of ACEs. And the other kind of ACE is adverse community environments. So Dr. Wendy Ellis from George Washington University has the Building Resilient Communities collaborative, and she has done unbelievable work. In fact, I don't know if you've ever seen this graphic, but it's a tree, and the branches of the tree are all the impact of adverse childhood experiences, but the roots of the tree are what happens when you couple that with an adverse community environment. So what kind of soil are you planted in?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where structural racism comes in: poverty, homelessness, housing insecurity, food insecurity. This is the world that I'm working in. And so that's why I really strongly believe that being trauma responsive has to be a universal precaution.
So can you tell us a bit more what you mean about being trauma responsive? How do people operate that and lead with that, like you said, and just assume that everybody's carrying some trauma?
Yeah, and it's really not hard. It's being kind, not being judgmental, being thoughtful, listening, not telling people what to do, but meeting people where they are.
Mm-hmm.
It's really creating a culture of caring and listening and kindness. I mean, imagine having that kind of culture in schools.
Mm-hmm.
So, and the reason I'm so invested in that piece of the work is because I believe strongly that there's a connection between ACEs and violence and gun violence.
Mm-hmm.
There's a direct link. I mean, there clearly is. And so I believe in this work. I believe that when schools are trauma responsive, the environment is such that we won't have a kid like the Parkland shooter who was expelled. And if you look at his history, and I'm certainly not condoning anything he did, please know that, but he also had a horrible childhood. Horrible. I mean, he was not with his parents. I think he had been in foster care. I think in foster care, either they died or it didn't work. I mean, he was expelled from school. He had years and years and years of trauma and disappointment, and nobody really was able to step in and help this kid.
Mm-hmm.
And not to mention, he also told everyone that he was going to be a school shooter. That's the other piece of this. The school shooters typically tell people, they leave messages. There's red flags that should be going up. And you hear now more and more that people are
Mm-hmm.
saying something if they see something.
Mm-hmm.
But why do we have to get that to this point? The reason I'm so involved with the firm is because their mission is to stop the shooter before they shoot. And that's based on research. Looking at research. I mean, school shootings, not just school shootings, but gun violence, period, has not been funded properly like any other epidemic. And it has had very little to no public federal funding for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, so anybody listening out there that's interested in any social justice causes, I mean, nursing has a place at the table with these things, and it's just amazing the impact you've been able to have in the work you've done, and you can clearly hear your passion for this. So I just want to take a moment and thank you for the work you're doing for, trying to make our world a better place, and for all those students as well. And yeah, if
I appreciate
anybody's,
that. Thank you.
yeah.
I think also, you know, nursing is political. I'm just going to say that. Nursing is political. We have a license to touch people. I don't think it gets more radical than that.
Hmm.
And I know people, sometimes nurses, oh, we can't be political. You better be political. We're in the situation we are because we haven't been, because we've
Hmm.
been so quiet.
Hmm.
We've been taking a back seat and letting other people tell us who we are and what we do and what we should do. And we've been like socialized to not speak up for ourselves. And I'm happy to see that that's definitely changing.
Yeah, I agree. And that whole do more with less. Oh, the budget's getting, tightened again. So you're losing this piece. So just, do more with less. And we've done that for so long. And now we've created these environments where we're burned out and we don't have proper staffing levels. And it's an epidemic across the world.
Mhm.
And really, the only way we're going to solve that is coming together and speaking up together. So we have work to do within our profession, but we also have a place at the table for some of these other causes as well, because nurses bring a different lens to social justice issues. We just do, and we deserve to be there. So I would encourage anybody that has a passion in an area to get involved outside of nursing as well, and bring your nursing voice to those causes. So Robin, I want to ask you, because you have done an incredible amount of work and you're very passionate about a lot of different pieces. As a leader in the nursing profession, what do you want your legacy to be? What
I
change would you
love
love
that.
to impact?
I love that. I wrote a blog post called GPS Your Nursing Legacy. And for many years I never thought about it. I didn't even it didn't cross my mind. And I realize now looking back that without having any goals, I was just kind of going along as I explained earlier, my kind of typical day, month, year.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in a school, you go by the school calendar, and boy, do those years fly fast,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, um, my legacy now, I want it to be that I help school nurses find their voice and amplify nursing through voice, through the narrative, through storytelling. I'm a blogger. I'm not a scientific writer. That is really painful for me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a scientist, although I love to do research in my way. Um, and so I like to tell stories. I like to tell other nurses stories. And I feel like my legacy, I hope, will be that I was able to change the course through nursing, gun violence prevention through the public health lens, and bring other nurses on board with me. Um, that to me would be a wonderful legacy to leave behind. I feel like every time I write a blog post, I'm kind of leaving a little bit of myself, because
Mm-hmm.
I feel like writing is a very vulnerable thing to do.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah, right. I'm sure you feel the same way. I was very fortunate, and this is another social media thing. I was invited to Washington, D.C. by a nurse congresswoman named Lauren Underwood. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
you're familiar with her, you might
Mm-hmm.
not be. Are
Yep.
you?
Yep.
Okay, so she's, I think 32 years old. She's from Illinois, and she's in her first term as a congresswoman. She just signed all of her paperwork to run again, which I'm really excited about. I'm not one of her constituents. I'm from New Jersey. She's from Illinois. But what happened was she wanted to do a press conference about the impact of gun violence in school. And someone from her office contacted the American Academy of Nursing, and the person they spoke to happened to see me on the future of nursing. I was
Mm-hmm.
I was on their town hall and spoke about school nursing, and I talked about gun violence in my 15 minutes, and they connected us. And Lauren Lauren Underwood invited me to her press conference, and it was in the end of September. It was, I think, of all my nursing days and decades, two probably stick out the most in my mind, maybe three, and that was absolutely number one or number two. Spending a big chunk of time with her in her office, going to the press conference, speaking at the press conference. Then I went to visit my congressman. I never had a Hill Day before, so this was my idea of a Hill Day. And then I ended the day, I have to say, I invited the dean of my nursing school. She came with me, and that was amazing because I am an adjunct faculty at Rutgers, and she has been, Dr. Donna Nikitas has been my biggest fan, champion. She's just an incredibly generous nurse activist herself. And so we've done some really fun things together, and she came with me. And we ended our day at the Brady Foundation. And the Brady Foundation was created by Jim and Sarah Brady. Jim Brady was Ronald Reagan's press secretary. And when Ronald Reagan was shot, Jim Brady was almost mortally injured. He survived a gunshot wound to the head. Spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair with tremendous deficits, but he was a gun violence prevention activist. And there's something called the Brady Bill that was passed that he pushed through. Anyway, I went to their headquarters. Chris Brown, who's the president of the Brady Foundation, she's my Twitter friend, and I wanted to meet her in real life. So that's where our day ended.
That's amazing. So for anybody listening that is a school nurse or interested in connecting with Robin to learn more about her activism work, we're going to make sure that Robin's blog and Twitter handles, as well as LinkedIn profile, are all linked in the show notes. So you'll be able to just click on over there to get connected with Robin, because I know people are going to want to carry on these conversations with you on social media as well, Robin. So we'll make sure people can reach you.
Thank you. I love that.
Yeah. What do you think is one of the biggest challenges facing nurses today, and how might we go about solving that challenge?
Well, I think we need to step out of our own way and understand the power that we have. There are 4 million nurses just in the United States. I'm not sure how many are in Canada. I know you guys have a tremendous Canadian Nurse Association. I think that we have to leverage the power that we have. I think that is one of our biggest challenges, is finding our voice as a collective and using it. And I can't stress enough that the power of social media can help nurses find their voice, find their like-minded colleagues on social media. I have to say, one of the best groups on Twitter it's a group of nurses from England, and they're called @WeNurses, WE Nurses. Have you run into them at all?
Yep, and they were featured in Jenny's presentation on Not Just a Nurse Day.
Oh,
yes, yeah.
Oh, they're the best. They have it down to such a science that I think they're actually giving certified nursing education credits for tweet chats now, Twitter chats.
Interesting.
I mean, they're doing such tremendous things on social media. So I feel like when we can leverage the power that we already have, that we just haven't tapped into, including being present on social media and not being afraid, I think things will change for us. We are powerful, and you can see it because when somebody attacks us from the outside, we stand up and we come together. We just need to do a better job at moving outside of our own circles and really reaching across to other sectors and explaining who we are, not letting other people define what is a nurse.
Yes, I love that. I so agree. And it was a politician in the States, I believe, that drew the ear of many nurses, I think it was last spring, when she said, all they do is sit around and play cards. And that turned into quite a viral sensation. And some of the memes that were created were hilarious. Yeah.
Right. That's a great example. I don't know how many thousands of packs of cards she got sent. But I know that was one of the things. But the other one that I think is a great example is Show Me Your Stethoscope. Are you familiar with how they started?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But why don't you dive into that a little bit, just for our listeners who maybe aren't aware? Yeah.
So there was a nurse who did the Miss America pageant. And in the Miss America pageant, for her talent, instead of singing or dancing or whatever, she told a story. Actually, it was called I'm Not Just a Nurse, I believe.
Really? That's
Yeah,
hilarious.
I'm almost positive that was the name of her poem. And it was like a spoken word thing. And she had a stethoscope around her neck. So she was wearing scrubs and a stethoscope. And the next day on The View, they made fun of her. And a woman in Missouri, now Missouri's the show me state, that's like their tagline, she put on Facebook, hey nurses, did you hear what happened on The View? Show me, because they're from the show me state, a picture of you wearing a stethoscope. Well, the thing went viral, and Show Me Your Stethoscope has turned into this huge organization. It really rivals any national nursing organization. So really interesting. They also partnered with the group that was working on safe staffing. So every year they join together. I think it's in April, and they have a Hill Day, and they canvass their legislators and talk about safe staffing ratios. So it really, really interesting what can happen when nurses join together.
Yeah, I totally agree. So if anybody is listening, Robin, what advice do you have that if they're feeling like, oh, I do want to get involved in some of these things, but I don't know, I'm not comfortable in politics, or I'm not a political person. What advice for them would you have?
I think you have to start really locally. You don't have to be a political person or feel comfortable in politics, but find what you're passionate about. We're all passionate about something in nursing, or we would not stay in the profession. Mm-hmm. So I think there are groups for everything possible that we're interested in, right? So I would start small. I would start locally. Start with one thing you're interested either in exploring, like in my case, after I got the training, from the Johnson & Johnson School Health Leadership Program, I was really interested in why my parents weren't connecting with their pediatricians. It was that sometimes it's like we're in inertia, and if we just move a little bit, mm-hmm. it propels us into action. And so if you can be in action around one issue that you're either curious about, want to learn more about, or even want to branch out and join an organization. I also believe strongly in being part of our local and national organizations, our specialty organizations. Mm-hmm. They need our support, and we need their support. So I think that's also maybe a safer place to start. And you can also find like-minded people and be present on social media. I mean, please follow me on Twitter. There's some great nurses out there doing tremendous work and wanting to share their resources, their research, collaborating. It's just a wonderful place to kind of jump in and out. I always say Twitter's like a river. You just jump in and you jump out and you jump right back in. You don't have to worry about what you might have missed, because it doesn't matter. It'll come back around again. Mm-hmm. I think it's being in action.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm writing a chapter for a collaborative book that I'm part of is this notion of 20 seconds of insane courage, and it came from that movie We Bought a Zoo. And really your entire life can change with just taking that 20 seconds of insane courage and putting that into action. So making that connection, sending that email, saying hi to that person, just throwing yourself into a different action than what you would normally take can completely change your life. And I think you have many stories that can demonstrate that as well. So it's one of the things that I just want to encourage the listeners as well, is to just, if you're feeling like you want to do something different or make a change or get involved in something, just take that 20 seconds of courage and just jump into it. Just put yourself into action before your brain can sabotage yourself, because it can totally and completely change your life.
Oh, I love that. 20 seconds of insane courage. I'm looking that up right now.
Yeah, you'll have to check it out. It's great. So Robin, as you know, the vision statement of the International Network of Nurse Leaders is that we believe in the power of nurses to change the world. What do you think of that statement? And in your opinion, I mean, we've talked a lot about different issues that nurses can put their collective voice behind, but I just want to know what your thoughts are around that, and are there some other areas that nurses should be banding together to bring a collective voice?
Oh, I love that statement. I am so inspired by the work that you're doing. And I really believe that when nurses collaborate and support each other, and, one thing I would love people to walk away with and understand that it's okay and it's actually important that we celebrate our accomplishments, that it is not boasting, that it's actually educating people about what we do and who we are. Most nurses complain that nobody understands our role, and that is because we have not done a good enough job in defining it. We have let other people define us, who we are, what we need, what we're capable of, what our education is. And so I really stress that if we could, celebrate each other's victories, support each other's curiosities, I think we would have a completely different experience as nurses.
I love that. So I can't believe how fast this time has gone. I want to ask you, what are some things that you see happening today that make you really proud to be a nurse and proud of where our profession is heading?
I am so super proud of the millennial nurses that are coming on board. I have an opportunity to teach the next generation of school nurses, and I'm so inspired by the dedication, by what I see. I'm so inspired by the curiosity that young nurses have, that they really take stands for themselves when we would not. And so that makes me feel really good about what's happening in nursing. I also think that we have this medium of instant connection that we never had when I was working for decades as a nurse, and it makes me feel much more connected to my colleagues than I ever felt before. And in school nursing, that's really important because we don't have colleagues right next to us. We're very much independent practitioners working solo. And so I value those connections, and I really enjoy how nurses that are coming into the profession now, what they're bringing with them, the stands that they're taking. I love the social justice that I'm seeing. I love the health equity that I'm seeing. I love that people are calling out racism. They're calling out sexism. I love the Time's Up healthcare movement. I just love the work that nurses are getting involved in.
I love that. Thank you. Okay, so Robin, was there anything that we haven't touched on today that you would like to chat about or have listeners know about before we...
I would just love everyone to register to vote.
Ooh, good plug.
Whoever you want to vote for, please just register and do it, and be a presence and do it as a nurse. And
yeah, I love that. Okay, so we are drawing to a close here, so I would love it if you could provide listeners with 3 tangible takeaways or pieces of advice.
Oh yes, connect and connect some more. Get on social media. Go tonight after you listen to this podcast and make your Twitter account. It's really easy. You can YouTube how to do it step by step. Make sure you have a LinkedIn account. Be really intentional how you use it, and do everything you can to connect to other nurses outside of nursing also, and let people know what you're doing. Be proud and share it.
I love it. All right. So to wrap up, we love closing with a story from our guests about their nursing career, and it can be any story that has had an impact on you. Do you have one that you could share with us today?
I do. Actually, I heard from this student today. I spent 11 years at one school. It was pre-K to 8th grade. And I made it a rule to not be in touch with my students because I felt on Facebook, I felt that was inappropriate. But after, a few years when they were older or graduated, if they would come to me, I would consider, connecting with them. So one student last year asked if he could connect with me on social media. I had him as a little guy when he was 9, and now he's 25. So I thought, you know what? Yeah, I'll do it. He sent me a message. I don't have it right in front of me, but the essence of the message was this. He said that he was 9 years old And one day he came to school. He was having a really hard time, really complicated family life. And I must have noticed that he was having a really hard day. And I had him spend a good chunk of the day with me in my office and didn't make him go to class. And he said that night, after he was going to go home from school, he had planned to commit suicide.
Oh my God.
And that because I had let him be with me that day and I'd showed him so kindness and understanding and compassion, he chose not to. And I could not believe this letter that he wrote me. He said, "I am here today for my sons because you were there for me."
Wow.
So when I think about him and I, sometimes get a little frustrated with my work,
Mm-hmm.
I remember that story, and you just never know. You might not ever know the impact you make on a patient, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you are privileged to know that impact, you have to share it and remember it and keep it close to your heart, so that when things get really hard, you have a reason to keep on, to go back to your next shift.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that incredibly impactful story, and just for the work you're doing, Robin. Just even that message of just be kind to people. I mean, it's not that difficult, and it could have such an amazing impact on society if we just started being kind to each other. So I just want to take a moment. I appreciate all the work you've done. Thank you for being such an amazing nurse leader, and such an inspiration for our profession. And for anybody that is looking to connect with Robin, we'll make sure we have all of those links in the show notes. Robin, do you want to just tell them as well where they can get your blog and your Twitter handle, just so it's on
Yes,
audio as well?
absolutely. Sure. So please follow me on Twitter at the @sign. That's always, think of it as address. So at Robin Cogan. That's it. My name, ROBINCOGAN. And my blog is called, it's relentlessschoolnurse.com. One word, relentlessschoolnurse.com.
Amazing. All right. So we'll make sure we'll have all those links. Robin, thank you so much. I totally appreciate the time. You are an inspiration. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, Amy. I can't believe it's over. That was so quick.
Well, we'll probably have to do another one in a few months again.
Anytime. My pleasure. And
Awesome.
Congratulations on the amazing work you're doing.
Oh,
I'm
thank
really
you.
proud to know you.
Thank you. I feel the same about you. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And yes, have a wonderful day.
Hi, nurses. I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Shift Change podcast. I want to take a moment and talk to you about something really important that's happening this year. As you probably know, World Health Organization designated 2020 as Year of the Nurse and Midwife. And while it's important to celebrate the nurses and participate in all these events that are happening, we need to make sure that we are being strategic about making this the year that we really use our collective voice to raise the profile and status of nurses and advance our profession. Understandably, some of you may feel resistance to this call to action. After all, how can we expect nurses to raise the profile and status of nurses and advance the profession when oftentimes nurses aren't even getting a proper break to sit down, eat something, or even use the bathroom on their shift? But you know what? If we don't act and act now, nothing will ever change. No one is coming to save the nursing profession from the burnout and exhaustion, from the staffing crises and nursing shortage, from the violence and bullying, from the budget cuts, and all the other threats to our profession that we are currently facing. Only we can save ourselves. And that can only happen when we decide enough is enough. We must decide that this is the year that we are going to use our collective voice to shout our value to the world, to introduce innovative and revolutionary ideas into healthcare, to advocate for our patients and our profession, to shed the just a nurse mentality and claim our position as leaders, and in doing so, change our profession. This year, 2020, Year of the Nurse and the Midwife, you get to decide. Is this the year that everything changes? Is this the year that we finally say enough is enough and break through the status quo? Is this the year that you, yes, each one of you, decide that you are tired of just complaining and actually put in the work to make a change? Because the truth is, it is up to us. And nothing changes if no one changes. Let me say that again. Nothing changes if no one changes. There is a movement happening, and it needs you. We are stronger together. Come join us as we disrupt the status quo and evolve our profession. It's time. It's our time. We're stronger together, so let's get started. If you want to know how you can join the movement of change, visit nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse to opt in for a free 3-part video series about how we can use 2020, the year of the nurse and midwife, as the year we use our collective voice and lead our profession forward. So jump on over to nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse for all the details. I'll see you over there. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you loved the advice shared on this episode, we would be so grateful if you would let us know. Please head over to Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, and subscribe to our show, and then rate us and leave your review. If you're not quite sure how to do that, you can head over to our website, nurseleaders.ca/connect, and there's an easy downloadable PDF that's going to walk you through the steps. We would be so grateful if you would take the time to subscribe, rate, and review. While you're on our website, nurseleaders.ca/connect, all of our social media handles are there, and we would love to get to know you on social media as well. Thank you again for listening today, and remember, nurses, we have the power to change the world. Let's start today.